Diagnosis by Edith Wharton. Narrated by Katrin Schmid. Chapter 1. Nothing to worry about. Absolutely nothing. Of course not. Just what they all say. Paul Dorrance walked away from his writing table to the window of his high-perched flat. The window looked south, over the crowded, towering New York, below Wall Street, which was the visible center and symbol of his life's work. He drew a great breath of relief, for under his surface incredulity, a secret reassurance was slowly beginning to unfold. The two eminent physicians he had just seen had told him he would be all right again in a few months, that his dark fears were delusions, that all he needed was to get away from work till he had recovered his balance of body and brain. Dorrance had smiled acquiescence and muttered inwardly, "Infernal humbugs, as if I didn't know how I felt." Yet hardly a quarter of an hour later their words had woven magic passes about him, and with a timid avidity he had surrendered to the sense of returning life. "By George, I do feel better," he muttered, and swung about to his desk, remembering he had not breakfasted. The first time in months that he had remembered that. He touched the bell at his elbow, and with half-apologetic smile told his servant that, well, yes, the doctor said he ought to eat more. Perhaps he would have an egg or two with his coffee. Yes, with bacon. He chafed with impatience till the tray was brought. Breakfast over, he glanced through the papers with the leisurely eye of a man before whom the human comedy is likely to go on unrolling itself for many years. Nothing to be in a hurry about, after all, was his half-conscious thought. That line which had so haunted him lately, about time-swinged chariot, relapsed into the region of pure aesthetics, now that in his case the wings were apparently to be refurled. No reason whatever why you shouldn't live to be an old man. That was pleasant hearing at 49. What did they call an old man nowadays? He had always imagined that he shouldn't care to live to be an old man. Now he began by asking himself what he understood by the term old. Nothing that applied to himself, certainly, even if he were to be mysteriously metamorphosed into an old man at some far distant day. What then? It was too far off to visualize. It did not affect his imagination. Why, old age no longer began short of 70. Almost every day the papers told of hardy old folk celebrating their 100th birthdays, sometimes by remarriage. Dorrance lost himself in pleasant musing over the increased longevity of the race, evoking visions of contemporaries of his grandparents, infirm and toothless, at an age which found their descendants still carnivorous and alert. The papers read, his mind drifted agreeably among the rich possibilities of travel. A busy man ordered to interrupt his work could not possibly stay in New York. Names suggestive of idleness and summer clothes floated before him. The West Indies, the Canaries, Morocco. Why not Morocco, where he had never been? And from there he could work his way up through Spain. He rose to reach for a volume from the shelves where his travel books were ranged, but as he stood fluttering its pages, in a state of almost thoughtless beatitude, something twitched him out of his dream. "I suppose I ought to tell her," he said aloud. Certainly he ought to tell her, but the mere thought let loose a landslide of complications, obligations, explanations. Their suffocating descent made him gasp for breath. He leaned against the desk, closing his eyes. But of course she would understand. The doctor said he was going to be all right. That would be enough for her. She would see the necessity of his going away for some months. Gradually, insidiously, there stole into his mind the thought, at first a mere thread of a suggestion, that this might be the moment to let her see, oh, ever so gently, that things couldn't go on forever. Nothing did. And that, at his age, and with this new prospect of restored health, A man might reasonably be supposed to have his own views, his own plans, might think of marriage with a young girl, children, a place in the country. His mind wandered into the dream as it had into the dream of travel. Well, meanwhile he must let her know what the diagnosis was. She had been awfully worried about him, he knew, though all along she had kept up so bravely. Should he, in the independence of his recovered health, confess under his breath that her celebrated braveness sometimes got a little on his nerves? Yes, it had been hard for her, harder than for anyone. He owed it to her to tell her at once that everything was all right as far as he was concerned, and in her beautiful unselfishness nothing else would matter to her, at first. Poor child, he could hear her happy voice. Really? Really and truly? They both said so? You're sure? Oh, of course, I've always known. Haven't I always told you? Bless her, yes, but he had known all along what she was thinking. He turned to the desk and took up the telephone. As he did so, his glance lit on a sheet of paper on the rug at his feet. He had keen eyes. He saw at once that the letterhead bore the name of the eminent consultant whom his own physician had brought in that morning. Perhaps the paper was one of the 3 or 4 prescriptions they had left with him. A chance gust from door or window might have snatched it from the table where the others lay. He stopped and picked it up. That paper on the floor held his fate. The 2 doctors had written out their diagnosis and forgotten to pocket it when they left. There were their 2 signatures and the date. There was no mistake. Paul Dorrance sat for a long time with the paper on the desk before him. He propped his chin on his locked hands, shut his eyes, and tried to grope his way through the illimitable darkness. Anything but the sights and sounds of the world outside. If he had had the energy to move, he would have jumped up, drawn the curtains shut, and cowered in his armchair in absolute blackness till he could come to some sort of terms with this new reality. For him, henceforth, the sole reality. For what did anything matter now, except that he was doomed, was dying, that these 2 scoundrels had known it, and that, having lied to him in their callous professional haste, they had tossed his death sentence down before him, forgotten to carry it away, left it there staring up at him from the floor? Yes, it would be easier to bear in a pitch-black room, a room from which all sights and sounds, all suggestions of life were excluded. But the effort of getting up to draw the curtains was too great. It was easier to go on sitting there, in the darkness created by pressing his fists against his lids. Now then, my good fellow, this is what it will be like in the grave. Yes, but if he had known the grave was there, so close, so all-including, so infinitely more important and real than any of the trash one had tossed the years away for. If somebody had told him, he might have done a good many things differently, put matters in a truer perspective, discriminated, selected, weighed. Or no, 1,000 times no. Be beaten like that? Go slinking off to his grave before it was dug for him? His folly had been that he had not packed enough into life, that he had always been sorting, discriminating, trying for a perspective, choosing, weighing. God, when there was barely time to seize life before the cup that held it was cracked, and gulp it down while you had a throat that could swallow. Ah, well, no use in retrospection. What was done was done. What undone must remain so to all eternity. Eternity. What did the word mean? How could the least fringe of its meaning be grasped by ephemeral creatures groping blindly through a few short years to the grave? Ah, The pity of it. Pity. Pity. That was the feeling that rose to the surface of his thoughts. Pity for all the millions of blind gropers like himself. The millions and millions who thought themselves alive, as he had, and suddenly found themselves dead, as he had. Poor mortals all, with that seed of annihilation that made them brothers. How he longed to help them. How he winced at the thought that he must so often have hurt them, brushing by in his fatuous vitality. How many other lives had he used up in his short span of living? Not consciously, of course. That was the worst of it. The old nurse who had slaved for him when he was a child, and then vanished from his life, to be found again, years after, poor, neglected, dying. Well, for her he had done what he could. And that thin young man in his office, with the irritating cough, who might perhaps have been saved if he had been got away sooner, stuck on to the end, because there was a family to support, of course, and the old bookkeeper whom Dorrance had inherited from his father, who was deaf and half blind, and wouldn't go either till he had to be gently told. All that had been, as it were, the stuff out of which he, Paul Dorrance, had built up his easy, affluent, successful life. But no, what nonsense! He had been fair enough, kind enough, whenever he found out what was wrong. Only he hadn't really pitied them, had considered his debt discharged when he had drawn a check or rung up a home for incurables, whereas pity he now saw. Oh, curse it, he was talking like a Russian novel. Nonsense, nonsense. Everybody's turn came sooner or later. The only way to reform the world was to reform death out of it. And instead of that, death was always there, was there now, at the door, in the room, at his elbow. His death. His own private and particular end of everything. Now. He snatched his hands away from his face. They were wet. A bell rang hesitatingly, and the door opened behind him. He heard the servant say, "Mrs. Wellwood." He stood up, blinking at the harsh impact of light and life. Mrs. Wellwood. Everything was going on again. People were behaving exactly as if he were not doomed. The door shut. "Eleanor!" She came up to him quickly. How close, alive, oppressive everyone seemed. She seldom came to his flat. He wondered dully why she had come today. She stammered. "What has happened? You promised to telephone at 10. I've been ringing and ringing. They said nobody answered." Oh, yes. He remembered now. He looked at the receiver. It lay on the desk, where he had dropped it when his eye had lit on that paper. All that had happened in his other life, before. Well, here she was. How pale she looked, her eyelids a little swollen. And yet how strong, how healthy, how obviously undeceased. Queer. She'd been crying too. Instinctively he turned and put himself between her and the light. "What's all the fuss about, dear?" he began jauntily. She colored a little, hesitating as if he had caught her at fault. "Why, it's nearly 1 o'clock, and you told me the consultation was to be at 9, and you promised—" Oh, yes, of course, he had promised. With the hard morning light on her pale face and thin lips, she looked 20 years older. Older than what? After all, she was well over 40, and had never been beautiful. Had he ever thought her beautiful? Poor Eleanor. Oh, poor Eleanor.